certainly interesting talk to hear your experience quite recently, I presume, in Israel. Yeah. The Israeli Committee Against House Demolition. Did you ever work with them directly? With them? I just wondered what you can tell me about how they work.
So the question was, did I work with the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions?
Yes.
No, I didn't, I'm afraid.
No.
I've heard various things about them. I've heard that they're quite an effective organisation, but I haven't worked with them personally, no.
It's an Israeli committee, not a Palestinian committee. I'm saying this not without some experience, because the director of the group, Jim Halpin,
Jeff Halpin.
yeah, has done several talks in the West Country. He's done a talk, you'd think he'd done a talk at the Ecumenical Centre. He's done a talk in Bath, and he's done a talk in not the Western Bath, I can't remember the name of the town. And I'm really impressed with his speech, but I wanted to know how effective they were in their own country.
He's actually at Khan al-Ahmar now, apparently.
So I'm asking this gentleman, please.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, I haven't worked with them personally myself.
Yeah.
I've never met Jeff,
No,
but
okay.
yeah, I mean, what I hear, they're very good organisation. They do good work.
Right, good to hear. Thank you.
Can we have another question, please? Come on, I'm sure you want to ask.
I've got a quick one. Can you tell us the make of the bulldozers that were they? In other words, are they made in the UK? I'm not. Those are the two things.
Well, that one's Hyundai. The question was, what is the make of the bulldozers? I didn't actually make a point of checking, but on that photo you can see one of them is Hyundai.
Going back a couple more slides, I noticed that when they showed, I think it was your video where they were going to demolition, I read not so long ago that a lot of Israeli soldiers are about 19 years old on average, whatever. And I was so shocked to see that those female soldiers, they look so young, and I just thought, if I had my daughter at 19 years old acting like that, I'd be so ashamed. There's one, if you show the video, you see it, and I just, you know, even from that, but just for, yeah, I mean, they look so young. Yeah, it just made an impression on me, pushing older women around me.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say for the rest of the audience who don't know, so the system in Israel is that you have to carry out military service when you reach 18. It's 3 years for men and it's 2 years for women. So most of the soldiers you encounter are, 18, 19, 20 years old. And yeah, I think it's, what I find most shocking is that they have to go and do this at such a young age, when they're basically still kids. And and for the parents as well, I've spoken to some Israeli parents who, are not exactly happy about their kids going out into the military. They have some understanding of what's happening, and it's heartbreaking for many people. But that's the system as it is in Israel at the moment.
Do you find that because of that there is obviously some kind of stress that they're going to be on, they're going to react stronger than they would out of fear? Do you think?
Yeah, so the question was, would people react stronger because they're younger? Yeah, maybe. If they're less mature, less able to cope with these sorts of situations, I could definitely believe that. Yeah, like I say, they're basically still children, and it's there's a lot of pressure. I mean, if you look in these situations, this is a very chaotic situation. You've got a lot of angry Palestinians who are trying to resist what you have been ordered to do by your commanding officer or whatever. It's not an ideal situation for anybody, even the soldiers, and not easy for anybody.
Yeah.
Jamie, I've got two questions. One, whether you had any experience of observing as children or minors were arrested, and stories about that. And also, during your 3 months, was there a tangible sense of the situation worsening as particularly the march of return in Gaza continues?
So the first question was, did I see any kids getting arrested? I don't think I did. I got some kids getting shot with rubber-coated bullets, kind of being rushed to ambulances and stuff. But no, not arrested, I don't think. With the second question was, are things getting worse? Yeah, I mean, 3 months is a very short period of time. So I arrived a couple of months after the embassy moved, the US embassy moved to Jerusalem. So, you know, there were some really big protests about that. That had all kind of quietened down a bit. Everyone's still very angry about it, but there weren't like massive protests all the time. Yeah, whilst I was there, the US announced that they were going to cut funding to the UN Relief and Works Agency, which works with Palestinian refugees, by $300 million. And obviously this was having a big impact, and the UN was really struggling to think, how on earth are we going to deal with this? You know, they use this money to pay for schools and other things. So that had a big impact. And then just as they were kind of trying to figure that out, the US announced that they were going to cut the rest of the funding. So in that sense, things did get a lot worse for Palestinian refugees from a resource point of view. And you know, things with the US are developing very quickly at the moment. So you got the deal of the century, I think it's called, which is the Trump administration's idea for how they can solve the Palestinian conflict. And you know, they haven't released all the details of what this will be yet, but it sounds very worrying, what I have heard. So things are developing pretty quickly, and I think over the next couple of years things are going to change quite a lot.
You mentioned that you actually saw some children being shot by rubber bullets. What did they do? What did they do to deserve that?
The question is, what did the kids do to deserve being shot? So this was, I was in a village called Kafr Kadum, which is in the north of the West Bank. Now every week they have a protest about a roadblock. So their road to the next nearest city, called Nablus, has been blocked since 2002, I want to say, quite 15 years, I think. And they have weekly protests against this roadblock to try and, you know, get it taken away so that they can get to the city again, because it's, you know, a really big deal. You know, you can't get to your nearest city. It takes 3 times as long to get there. It means that services that are sourced from the city cost 3 times as much. So they have a weekly protest, and this protest is generally very violent. And I think the day I was there, they didn't use live ammunition. They sometimes do, but they used rubber-coated bullets, and 9 people, I think, were injured with rubber-coated bullets that day. I think actually there was only 1 child that was injured that day. But yeah, it was quite striking to see this screaming small child being kind of carried hurriedly to an ambulance. It's, yeah.
You say the protest was violent. When you're saying violent,
Could
do
you
you
speak
mean,
up, please?
sorry, when you're saying the protest was violent, what do you mean by violent? Do you mean the Palestinians were violent? How were they violent? Or was it the soldiers that were violent?
So the question was, who was being violent in this protest? The Palestinians do, in this protest, there is quite a lot of stone throwing from Palestinians, where, you know, Palestinians don't have weapons in the same sense as the Israeli military does, but quite often they will throw stones at soldiers and stuff like that. Yeah, so violence on both sides, yeah.
Sorry.
On the subject of rubber bullets, in 1974, a long time ago, I came back from Switzerland as a teacher and did the first ever dyslexia course in this country when dyslexia was being recognised. 2 of the loveliest people who attended that course were 2 speech therapists from the Children's Hospital in Northern Ireland. And they were working with children who'd been shot with rubber bullets during the Troubles in Belfast in Ireland. and they explained to me how children were being hit with rubber bullets, and depending what part of their face it hit, the neurological problems were coming later, and some children were losing the power of speech and having to be retaught to speak again. So going back even then, 40 odd years ago, it was acknowledged that rubber bullets aren't as safe as they're made out to be. So I'm just horrified really that is there not a law against this? Does the UN allow rubber bullets? Are they not being banned like landmines or whatever? And I'm just shocked that they're still using them and aiming them at children and older people.
Yeah, so the question is you know, are there any rules on how you can use rubber bullets? So I'd say my understanding is that there are all sorts of different types of rubber bullets, and it may well be that the ones that the Israeli military are using are very different to the ones in Northern Ireland. I don't know. But so what it comes down to is whether the force that the military uses is excessive or not. And it's always a bit subjective. But generally speaking, you're not supposed to use weaponry against civilians unless your life is kind of in danger. But you know, with rubber-coated bullets, they are usually not lethal. I mean, the UN heavily criticises Israel in general for its excessive use of force. In any specific situation, it's sometimes difficult to tell, you know, was this excessive or not? You know, I mean, for instance, if you've got a Palestinian that's running at you holding a big rock, maybe it is appropriate to shoot a rubber-coated bullet at them under some circumstances. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, as a general trend, the use of force is excessive in Palestine, and these weapons, they can be lethal sometimes. They can cause brain damage, all sorts of issues. So they should be, you know, used very sparingly.
When there's injuries, how easy is it for ambulances to actually get to somebody that's injured?
Yeah, so one story I heard, there was this kid, again, in Kafr Kadam, this was a few years before I visited, who was shot with live ammunition this time, in the leg. And, you know, he was lying there on the ground with his leg shot, and a family friend ran over to, you know, pick him up and carry him to an ambulance. And then they shot him too. So maybe that gives you an idea of it's not, you know, not always easy to take injured Palestinians to get medical treatment. It depends entirely on the situation. So yeah, it varies a lot. How close the ambulance can get, how appropriate it is for them to go and collect casualties will vary a lot.
When you just talking about this protest, you've actually mentioned the reason for this protest is because there's a block between the village and the nearest town, which is Nablus. Now,
could you speak up, please?
sorry, yeah. What I was saying is, Jamie was saying the reason for the protest is because there is a block between the village, a barrier put by the Israeli army between this village and the nearest town. Now, I was in Nablus in 2012, and if I remember rightly, the nearest place for anyone to be treated that I know of would be in Nablus, which means there is a block on the road going to Nablus, so any casualty would have to navigate that block. So that must, I assume, therefore make it more difficult for anybody that is injured to get treatment. Would that be right?
Yeah, so the question was, does this roadblock make it more difficult for people to get medical treatment? Absolutely. So there's like in this village that day, there was like a makeshift clinic. I mean, they do this every week, so they kind of know what to expect. A makeshift clinic in the local mosque, where they were kind of treating people and then sending the more severe cases on to hospital. It is possible to get to Nablus, it just takes 3 times as long. And yeah.
Who wants to say something? Right, okay. Gentleman over there, and then somebody at the back. Thank you.
During those 3 months, did you ever have to intervene in situations like on the video, or speak to Israeli soldiers and get what they were doing? Did they feel guilty for all those kind of scenarios?
So the question was, did I ever intervene in situations with the soldiers? In violent situations, very much not. You know, they're the ones with the guns, and I don't want to yeah, basically. I mean, it was already me standing there. I think my program would have said I was a bit too close there, but I wanted to be able to film what was happening. In non-violent situations, we do sometimes interact with soldiers. We generally try not to for our own security, because the military can cause all sorts of problems for us. They don't want us to be there. They can take photos of our passports. They can detain us maybe. A few years ago, the entire Bethlehem team was deported because they encountered the wrong border police people, and they didn't like them, and they took them back to Israel, and they were all sent back home. So that's a real danger for us. In some situations, we do interact with them where we feel it's appropriate. So at the checkpoint, for instance, like there's this extra gate which they can open to let through humanitarian cases. So this is like disabled people, old people, and we will, call them up to try and get them to open this gate. And if we can catch the eye of a soldier, we'll kind of wave and see if he can open the gate. And occasionally, other times as well, we'll interact with them, but generally not. No.
One of the things you mentioned is they actually lock the turnstiles that the people going through the checkouts actually have to go through. How does that work? I mean, I know from my own experience because I was locked into one, but obviously the audience don't. Can you explain that?
Yeah,
please?
sure. Yeah. So the question is about the turnstiles and the checkpoint. Each checkpoint is different. I'll talk about the one in Bethlehem because that's the one I know best. There's multiple stages. So I showed you a video earlier. This is showing the queue to get into the first stage of the checkpoint, where there's a single turnstile, which is usually open continuously, like always turning, people going through. The military will sometimes lock that for some periods of time. Now, sometimes this seems to be arbitrary. Other times, maybe it's because there's a queue building up later in the checkpoint, so maybe they're wanting to kind of make sure that queue doesn't get too long. It's often difficult for us to tell. If you're stood in one place in the checkpoint, you don't know what's going on elsewhere. Then there's another stage where there's 4 turnstiles at the next stage. I've never seen all 4 open. I think the maximum I've seen open is 3 at a time. Those then go to metal detectors where you put all your belongings through and you go through a scanner. And there's another turnstile after that, which again can be locked sometimes. Then the final stage is a permit check, where they check that you have permission to go into Israel. I haven't talked at all about the permit system. I will only say that it's a complete nightmare to get permission to go into Israel if you're Palestinian. If you're international, it's trivial. You just wander in, show your passport, and you're through, no problem. For Palestinians, it's very, very, very difficult. If you have permission to go through, and if your permission hasn't been revoked or whatever, and the soldier doesn't cause you extra problems, because they can sometimes, even if you have permission, then you go through that last stage, and then you're through. So that's kind of the layout of the checkpoint in Bethlehem.
Even though most of the people going through have got work, they still find it difficult. Is that true?
Yeah, so I think the way the system works is that in order to have a work permit to go into Israel, I think you need to have a job on the other side. You can't just say, I'm going through to work. I think that's one of the requirements, if I remember correctly, yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of issues. You might turn up for work one day and be told, no, you've been taken off the list, your permit has been revoked. And that might be it. You might never be able to return to Israel. And you might never be told why. So all sorts of issues there.
Looking at the footage you have with the checkpoints, staying on this subject, there seem to be an awful lot of people working on what you've just said. It must take quite a lot of time, various time, to get through there. How does that impact, therefore, as far as you're concerned, on people that need to get to work? Do they have to build in extra time? Is it a possibly you'll go to work, possibly you'll get there and be rejected thing? What's happening?
So the question was about the time it takes to go through the checkpoints and what the impact of that is. So our checkpoint duty in the mornings would start at 4 o'clock in the morning, because that's when people would start to turn up in large numbers to get through. because, like you say, it can take a very long time to get through. And then once you're on the other side, you're not at work yet. You know, you're just on the other side in Bethlehem. You may then need to travel all the way to Tel Aviv or Haifa. It might be a very long bus journey ahead of you until you can get to start at work, which, you know, you might be starting at 9 o'clock or something. So, yeah, people need to get there very, very early to be guaranteed to get to work on time. If you turn up later, if you turn up at 7 o'clock, you know, maybe you get lucky and maybe things are fairly smooth that day, or maybe you get unlucky and by the time you get to the other side, you know, your bus has left or your employer has kind of taken someone else on for that day. Because most of these Palestinians are paid on a daily basis. So if you don't turn up to work, you don't get paid. And by not turning up, that might mean, you know, just getting delayed in a checkpoint more than usual.
How does that work coming back at the end of the day? Because you've had a very long day, you've had to stay for hours to get through, then travel to work, coming back. Have you had any experience of the return?
Yeah, so questions about the return journey through the checkpoint, much, much easier. So again, in Bethlehem, the system is there's 2 turnstiles, one after the other, which are, I've never seen them locked, like in the day. They're locked at night and stuff, but so it's much easier to go through. That's it. I think Israel doesn't care so much if you're going into Palestine, they only care if you're coming into Israel. So that's generally not so much of a problem.
Right, I think there was a question. Yes, at
comment,
the end.
sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, brilliant presentation. Thank you, Jamie. One thing, I'm slightly kind of confused with the concept of violent protests. I sort of just dislike it, but I want to dispute it actually with you. The thing is, I mean, if the context where the protests are happening are the neighborhoods of, you know, occupied territories, which is, you know, foreign military is invading internationally occupied territory, and people are throwing stones at them, you don't really hear about, you know, burnt houses, Israeli children killed, or whatever. To what extent it is kind of correct to call the legitimate resistance of, you know, people living in their homes, throwing stones on invading soldiers, you know, equipped with machine guns and jeeps and everything. Is that violent? How to say, protest?
So the question is it violent to throw stones in this context? So I didn't say that I thought it was illegitimate. I mean, yeah, if you have a foreign army that's kind of coming into your country, I mean, like if for instance, you know, the UK was invaded by a foreign army, if we were to respond with violence, that might be entirely appropriate. And so it's not. I mean, I generally don't like violence. I think, and specifically in the Israel-Palestine situation as well. I think things like throwing stones, I personally believe is unhelpful to the Palestinian cause. I know there's a lot of people who disagree with me on that, and I encounter a lot of people who disagree that it's violence as well. Like you were saying, it's so some people will see stone throwing not as violence, but as sending a message or something similar, and they'll kind of say, you know, because of the huge disparity, like you've got this one of the best equipped armies in the world, with, you know, all their guns and everything, and then you've got civilians, and all they have is stones that they're throwing. So they often don't think of it as being violent because of this disparity. My personal view is that it is violence. You know, if you get hit by a big stone on your head, that can kill you sometimes. I mean, I think.
But whom? Whom are they throwing stones at? Sorry, but whom are they throwing stones at, as you witnessed?
Well, I mean, in this protest I was talking about, they were throwing stones at Israeli soldiers.
So invading soldiers.
Yeah.
And so actually, the presence of these soldiers is the crime, is the violence itself, isn't it? I mean, I'm not disputing the morality, but the morality of the description. I mean, behind the description of a violent act when you are defending your, you know, presence in your land invaded by foreign military, with historic record of violence, killing, occupying, oppressing, and everything. So it's not, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can I can relate to why they do it, and the situation is really bad. You do have this, this foreign army coming in and doing awful, terrible things. The question of whether it's violence or not, I think is a separate issue of whether it's justified or not. Like I say, my personal view is that stone throwing is violence. Whether or not it's justified, I don't know. I think we can each of us make our own judgment on that, on the morality of it, and I think it's not a straightforward question, I don't think.
Before I go to the next question, could I just clarify? You say they're throwing stones. Now, are we then talking about a row of soldiers stood there, or are we talking about army jeeps with soldiers there? Are they literally throwing at the actual vehicles with the soldiers? Is that what we're talking about? Or are we talking about a row of soldiers actually as physical targets?
So the question is it soldiers stood on their own, or are they in jeeps or whatever? It varies. Sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other.
Okay, thank you. There's a lady over here.
Just in kind of response to what Guy Blair was saying, I mean, I guess if you're a kid and you've grown up experiencing everything that's been happening, and so as you said, you're a kid, I mean, you're a kid, of course you're going to throw stones if you see what they're doing to other people in Palestine. I don't think stone throwing is a bit like that. Kids throw stones over here.
Yeah.
I don't think that's like, I don't know, I just don't think that's really a violent thing. I think if you're a kid and you're watching this happen to your where you live every day, kids do a lot worse than throw stones.
Yeah, I mean, I think it will vary. I mean, obviously, you know, like the size of the stone that's being thrown and stuff like that. We'll talk about like how likely it is to injure somebody. Okay, it's not maybe not as straightforward as I was suggesting it is, and if you're throwing small stones that you know have no chance of injuring someone, then maybe that wouldn't be counted as violence. But I mean, you know, in some cases, if it's a larger stone, and you know, like I say, if you get hit in the head with a large stone, that can really injure you quite badly. So I personally would say that is violence.
But that's against soldiers, right?
It's often against soldiers, yeah. So
And they're fully uniformed and protected.
often, yeah. So I mean, one thing I didn't mention was in when the home demolitions were taking place, 2 Israelis were injured that day as well from stone throwing. I don't think they were soldiers that were injured. They were like contractors from the municipality that were carrying out the demolition. So in their case, they weren't kind of protected with all the protective gear, and they didn't have military training or anything.
Yeah, but then none of these people here who were protesting got any protective gear as well. So
Yeah.
I just don't. Yeah, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, I would say there was a huge disparity here between, like, regardless of whether you think that it's violence or not, with Palestinians throwing stones, it's nothing compared to an Israeli soldier shooting a machine gun at a Palestinian. That is a totally different thing. So I will highlight that.
Helen?
My point's been
Right.
really
Okay.
disproportionate.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, lady there, and then lady over there.
I think it might be useful for us to move on from this discussion. I've been an ecumenical company myself about 4 years ago, and one of the things as an ecumenical accompanier in East Jerusalem that struck me was that there were almost no occasions on which, and no institutions that I could observe, where Israelis and Palestinians were able to meet up in their day-to-day lives. And I wonder, Jamie, whether whether you observed any possible opportunities in Bethlehem for this to happen. Because it did strike me that, you know, when both sides are frightened of each other and there is not this chance to meet, whether you ever found that there was such a thing in the Bethlehem situation, apart from over the barrel of a gun, which we've been describing rather luridly.
The question is, was there an opportunity in Bethlehem for Israelis and Palestinians to meet each other? Generally not. So in a lot of Palestine, it's actually illegal for as you know, it's illegal for Israelis to enter parts of Palestine, including most of the major cities like Bethlehem. So already, if you go into Bethlehem as an Israeli, you're committing a crime, and you could potentially be arrested because of that. There was one organisation I came across called Combatants for Peace, which is a kind of joint Israeli-Palestinian organisation that tries to link people up to get people meeting and talking about the situation. I never went to one of their meetings, but I did hear about one in Bethlehem. So there are some small efforts, but generally not. Generally, there's not much opportunity to do this. No.
Lady over here.
I just wanted to, you commented on your experience of being locked out of the checkpoint, you said?
Me?
Yeah?
Oh yeah, that was.
Yeah. I just wanted to know, like, how you saw people react to it being locked out and then not being able to pass through.
Okay, I actually was locked into it.
Oh, okay.
I was going into Jerusalem from Nablus, and I was in a small queue of people going through because of the time of day I was going through. And there was a little 6-year-old boy, I know he's 6 because we were on the same bus afterwards, who was going to school in front of me. So what you have to do, and his mother was in front of him, children have to go separate if they can walk. And what happened, he went in front of me, and you go into the turnstile, and then they locked it, so you're stood there. And they wait until they decide to unlock it. And then you go through to the metal detector, etc., etc. And then when you go through the metal detector and the sort of doorway you have as you would in an airport, at that point you have to stand. They shout at you, you see. It's stop, move, stand. That's what they shout all the way through. Okay? And when you then have to stand, he had to stand, and they said, no, go back. So you had to go back through the metal detector, back through the turnstile, going the other way, and do it again. Okay? He was locked in it again. And this is a 6-year-old on his way to school. And he does it every day, obviously. And so I was watching this, which made me feel fantastic, you can imagine, because I'm next. And I didn't think for one moment, they didn't know who I was, really care. So when I went through, again, I was locked. And while you're locked in there, a soldier has a gun pointing about equivalent distance to that pillar at your head. For the child, he was pointing at the chest, actually, because I was probably too small a target. And they just stand there. It seemed forever. It was probably a few minutes. And then they opened it, and I had to put my stuff on the conveyor belt, take off my jacket. They shout at me for this. And then I went through the metal detector, and they said back. So I had to go back, and I had to do it again. Go back through the checkpoint, going the other way, come back in there, lock again, like this. Soldier, gun to your head. And then finally, when I went through the other thing, once I got told stand, then it's permit. And I had to go for my passport to the window. Again, the soldier never leaves, that gun does not leave you. It is still pointed at you while you're walking across. And it stays there, pointed at you, while you put the passport in. And like I said, I saw this happen to this child. It happened to me. So it's scary. I've never felt so scared in my life.
Sounds horrendous.
It was horrendous. But what was horrendous is that child in front of me, I know, goes 5 days a week back and forth through this checkpoint.
talk to me was the most concerning part of your talk was about the home demolitions. I don't think we've had people coming that had such a close experience of being close to demolitions themselves, not since the visits I've made. In this country, all we get on the literature on this is from the IACH, and that sounds as though they're doing quite a combative job out there, but we're not ever sure. I'm not sure. I know the director came here, Jim, and gave some really good talks all around the West Country, but I'm just wondering, Jamie, if you're just being a bit polite in saying that you know nothing about them when you was out there. Is there some reason you just didn't come up against them, because they're common knowledge over here as being quite combative in this house demolition?
So the question was I telling the truth before when I said that, that I haven't encountered ICAD on the ground?
Well, I just wondered if you had heard more, but someone was trying to interrupt me. Perhaps they're right. Is more that I don't know. I mean, I can open the question generally if you like. I'd just like to know how effective the ICH are in Israel against how much they stand up to the horrific demolitions that are going on.
So again, what I do hear about ICAD is all good things. I hear that they're a very effective organisation at what they do. I was only personally present for these demolitions that took place. Generally, demolitions happen in the middle of the night, at 2 a.m., 4 a.m.
Yeah.
There's actually rules for us as EAs that we're not allowed to be out in dark, generally. The idea is that it's much more dangerous because you're not protected by your uniform if the soldier can't see the uniform. They just see a figure in the darkness. Maybe they're more likely to kind of shoot you or whatever. So we generally don't go out at night. These demolitions were somewhat unusual in that they were later on in the morning. Yeah, again, I can only repeat what I said before, that I haven't personally encountered ICAD on the ground.
There are people in Bristol who have done house rebuilds with ICAD, and there are people in Bristol who have done house rebuilds with Amos Trust.
I have a question relating back to the discussion about this issue of violence from the Palestinians as opposed to the violence from the Israeli military and the settlers. I think, if I heard correctly, there was this thing about violence from the Palestinians, but over the decades and the years that Palestinians have been under occupation, generations have grown up that have been brutalized, have only ever known occupation. And I don't think it's, I think people need to understand that people have grown up and they've known nothing but this occupation, and to expect people to act in a rational manner when they've never really ever had a freedom or a normal life. And then there's also the other aspect that there is a lot of non-violent action against the occupation. So I don't know if I heard correctly that people talking about the stones from the Palestinians and and to a degree sometimes armed resistance, but then they're being subjected to an unjustified occupation. So I think people are only acting in a human way, and people are being brutalized. I think that's the gist of what I'm trying to highlight.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, it's a very, very, very difficult situation for Palestinians, and the occupation of Palestine began in '67, more than 50 years ago. So there's a whole generation, 2 generations, who have not even known life that's not under Israeli occupation. So it's very difficult situation for them. Yeah.
Can I just add? I mean, I think from a human point of view, if you're subjected to that kind of unjust brutalization, anybody's going to crack, anybody's going to act in a violent way, because That's what Israel wants to do in order to say, you see, these people are violent, but it's Israel that are imposing violence against the Palestinians and destabilizing the whole of Palestine. They don't want a peace. I mean, the Zionists and the right-wingers, they want to prove that there's no such thing as a democratic Palestine. I mean, am I making myself clear?
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Like I said, I completely agree with you. It's an awful situation. Whether or not violence on the part of the Palestinians, if you want to use that word for it, is justifiable. I think we can all make our own judgment by seeing what the situation is, understanding that, and then saying, well, what would we do if we were in their shoes? Yeah, it's. I understand what you're saying.
Can I
Yep,
just
okay.
ask a question? You mentioned that it is illegal for Israelis to enter a Palestinian town and area, part of the area which is under the actually Palestinian Authority, I'm assuming you're talking about. How does that actually work? Because when I was in Bethlehem coming out of the city, a settler came across from the settlement onto a Palestinian road, which I know is illegal the other way round, and threw stones at our taxi as we were actually driving on a hairpin breadth at 120 k's. That was scary. But what I am saying, and he had a gun. So technically I'm assuming he was illegal doing that. But what I'm saying is there is a lot of reports of settlers going into villages and actually doing damage and actually disturbing Palestinians trying to go to their fields and everything else. Now, I'm not asking you to answer that as such, it's a sort of comment. So how does this law about them actually being illegal if they go into a Palestinian area actually work? It doesn't appear it works to me.
Yeah, the question was about the implementation of the law saying that Israelis shouldn't enter areas A and B rather than area C. There's kind of 3 areas of the West Bank. These areas are more under Palestinian control. Area C is completely under Israeli control. Yeah, I don't know the details. I mean, it certainly does happen that Israelis will enter these areas. I would also say there's a lot of laws which settlers in particular break a lot. They shouldn't be attacking Palestinians under any circumstances by Israeli law, but the police and the military are generally very lenient and will just kind of ask them politely to please move along and just go home. They won't kind of arrest them and put them in prison for 5 years. So yeah, I mean these laws are kind of, it depends on the situation, but they're generally not implemented very well. No.
Can I just make one point and then I come to you? Is that all right? The other thing that when I was in Nablus, now that is part of under the Palestinian Authority technically, but I was given to understand by Palestinian policemen that if the IDF appear, they have to stand down. They have no authority in their city whatsoever. The minute the IDF appear, they take over militarily authority. And there is no such thing as the Palestinian police authority under that circumstance. Do you know whether that's right?
I have heard about that happening. I'm not sure about the question was, does the Israeli military sometimes take control of situations outside Area C, so in areas A and B, where the Palestinian Authority is supposed to have security control? It does sometimes, yeah, I've heard of it happening that the Israeli military will go in and do something. Like in Bethlehem, for instance, it's quite common in the refugee camps there that the military will turn up in the middle of the night to, arrest people or just generally like maybe carry out a training exercise or something else. And I think they generally warn the Palestinian Authority ahead of time, so they know that they shouldn't be there, that they have to move out. So it does happen. I'm not sure exactly the mechanisms behind how it happens. I mean, because they're not supposed to be doing that by the kind of the rules that that were negotiated in what are called the Oslo Accords in the 90s. But it does happen, yes. Yeah.
Thank you. Hisham?
Yes. I think it's whether it's under Israeli law, whether it's legal or not legal for the Israelis to get into Area A. I don't think there is a law, as far as I know, but there is this kind of warning. If you get into Area A, you are there under the risk. You might risk your life or whatever. But as far as I know, there isn't a law. I don't know. I'd be, happy to read or see the sources on that. But I mean, an evidence on it. 2017, I was in Bethlehem, for instance, and Professor Ilan Pape gave a lecture in the city of Bethlehem, and he didn't take any permission from it. My point here is that it sounds like there is a parity, there is equal conditions. Palestinians are not allowed to go into Israel, and Israelis are not allowed to go into, and so it's a fair game. That is my understanding, and I don't think it's fair. The second point on this, areas A and B in reality are less than 30% of West Bank, which is according to the international law within the occupied Palestine of 1967, right? So it's 70% of the occupied Palestine is open space for all Israelis, military settlements, and there's not even a warning. So I think, making those details clear makes a fairer, I think, description of the situation. If you have any comments.
Yeah. The question was again about Israelis being allowed to visit Palestine. So the signs that I saw when I was in Bethlehem said that it's illegal. When I asked people about it, like Israelis about it, and I kind of said to them, "Why don't you go and visit Bethlehem?" They said it was illegal as well. Well, like I say, the sign said illegal.
Just the signs. There is no law in Israel. Israel says to the Israelis that all this is Israel. So it's not illegal for any Israeli to go to Israel. So, so this is my point.
Yeah, I've been told that people have been arrested before for entering there by the Israelis. So I mean, I guess what does illegal mean? I'm not. Yeah, all I can say is what I've been told by people and what I've seen on the signs. Yeah, you're absolutely right to point out that in Area C, Israelis are totally allowed to go wherever they want by Israeli law. Yeah, this is where all the settlements are, and you've got about 600,000 Israelis living in Palestine in Area C, illegally by international law in these settlements as well. So yeah.
I'm really sorry, but we really should wind up now.